Welcome to the first ever Save the Frogs Australia-New Zealand video conference series. I am Save the Frogs founder, Dr. Kerry Kriger, and I'm happy to be doing this. I spent 4 years in Australia doing my PhD research, and I spent some time, not that much time, but I definitely spent some time in New Zealand looking for frogs. Also spent a few months trekking around New Zealand. And I am very happy to have a special guest, an expert on New Zealand's frogs, Dr. Phil Bishop. And Phil helped us out about 6 years ago. We ran a campaign to protect some frogs from mining. Perhaps he'll tell us about that and what the fate of those frogs has been. Phil has 20 years of amphibian experience in New Zealand. He's a professor of zoology at the University of Otago. He's co-chair of the IUCN SSC Amphibian Specialist Group and chief scientist of the Amphibian Survival Alliance. And he knows a whole lot about New Zealand's frogs. So I'm going to turn it over to Phil, and he's going to tell us all about the ancient weirdos of the amphibian world. And hopefully we can do this without any technological glitches going well. I believe he's going to be on PowerPoint. But you're welcome to do whatever it is you want to do, Phil.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks very much, Kerry, and it's good to be here, and nice to catch up with new friends and an old friend too. Okay, so I'm going to try and share my screen and see what happens. So we can just see what happens. Oh, now everyone's going to see all my private stuff here as well. So now what I'm going to try and do, desktop 1, desktop 2. Let's go with desktop 1. And I'm going to then try and work my PowerPoint as well. So please tell me if you can see it.
Yeah, it's good.
So you can see it?
Probably, I can see it. Yeah, you can probably expand it. Yeah, that's it. That's your whole screen. Good.
That's my whole screen, so everyone can see that okay?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so I'm just going to be telling you about, I could spend hours telling you about this, so it was very difficult because Kerry said that I should only spend about 20 minutes. So
you can take some more time if you want. We have plenty. We're not in a hurry.
Well, that's good. Well, other people might be, especially Stefano, who's might fall asleep in a minute, but being midnight there. Okay, so that's the former Prime Minister, John Key, and I was always hoping that this picture was going to come back and upset him, but he's resigned, so he's no longer our Prime Minister, so I haven't got the opportunity to embarrass him. But like Kerry was saying earlier, that during his reign, he was going to open up a key piece of habitat in the Coromandel that we'll see in a bit later, which was the prime habitat for Archie's frog, which is the #1 edge amphibian. It's critically endangered, and he was going to open that up to mining, and I was hoping to use this picture against him. But as I said, I never got the chance to do that, and now I've got to try and catch the new Prime Minister in a similar embarrassing pose with a native frog. So what sort of amphibians do we have in New Zealand? And we have 4 endemic native species. So that means that they only occur in New Zealand. They are very unusual. They're all in the same genus, which is Leiopelma. And it's this one over here. So can you see my mouse when I do that? Everyone see the mouse? Yep, that's good. Okay, so that's Leiopelma archii there. So we've got 4 endemic native species, 3 of which are fully terrestrial. They can never go in the water. They lay their eggs on land. They do everything on land. And we've got 1 that is semi-aquatic. So it likes to be on land, but it can also flip in and out of the water as well. And I'll tell you a bit more about that. We also have 3 introduced species that have become naturalized. They were introduced back in the late 1800s, mainly by the European settlers who thought it would be really nice if we had some frogs croaking at the ponds, and their tadpoles would supply some nice nutrients for ducks. So we've got a lot of duck hunters and people who are interested in ducks here. So they felt, well, get some more tadpoles in there and the ducks can eat that, and hopefully the frogs will eat some of the mosquitoes and things. So they introduced many species actually, but they've only had 3 species that have become naturalized and are doing very well in New Zealand. Now, these are species that used to be in the genus Littoria, but there's been some odd things going on with the nomenclature and a little bit of infighting going on with the people who like to change names. And I think at the moment, and perhaps Kevin might be able to tell us a little bit more, but I think people have agreed at the moment that the bell frogs, that are those two big green ones here on the bottom left of your screen, these are now Rhinoidea, whereas the little brown one up here is still in the genus Littoria. So out of those 7 species of amphibians that we have that you can find in the wild in New Zealand, we've got 6 globally threatened species. So all the Leiopelma species are threatened, and these 2 big green Australian species here, the big green warty one in the foreground is Rhinoidea rhiniformis, which is endangered, and the more delicate one in the background there, Rhinoidea aurea, is vulnerable in Australia. We also have 2 salamanders that are in the pet trade that conservationists in New Zealand are very nervous about them getting out into the wild. And that's the Mexican axolotl and also the fire-bellied newts. We've got Japanese and Chinese fire-bellied newts, and people are a little bit concerned about them getting out into the wild. And we also have other species that keep popping up every now and then of hobbyists bringing them in illegally and releasing them. And at the moment, we're dealing with an alpine newt incursion up in the North Island, and they've been they probably actually were responsible for bringing chytrids into the country, but they're slowly being eradicated up in the Waikato region. So what about the distribution of these amphibians in New Zealand? So on the upper North Island, you remember New Zealand is made up of these 2 islands. We've got a North Island and a South Island, and from a frog point of view, it's only the upper part of the South Island that's really interesting. So the rest of the South Island, which is the most beautiful part of New Zealand, is not shown on this picture here. So on the upper North Island, and you can basically draw a line across round about this area here at about 38 degrees. And the upper North Island there has Leiopelma archii, which are the red dots. They occur up here in the Coromandel, and some down here in a place called Farriarina. We've got Leiopelma hochstedteri, which are the orange dots here, very much in the Bay of Plenty over here, scattered populations through the Coromandel, and then up around the Hanuas and in the Auckland region up here. We've got Rhinoidea aurea distributed all over the northern part of the North Island, and then we've got Rhinoidea rhiniformis, which is distributed over the whole of the North Island and the whole of the South Island that we'll see a bit later. And then we've got Littoria ewingi that is patchy distribution on the North Island, but occurs on most of the South Island. The Cook Strait is a very interesting place to go. There's a whole load of islands, and we'll be having a look at those in more detail a bit later on. We've got one tiny little island here that has Leiopelma hamiltoni, and another tiny island in the Marlborough Sounds where we find Leiopelma parkeca. And there are no living examples of Leiopelma on the South Island at the moment that we find. There's lots of really good habitat, and it's in my dream that I will go there and explore some of those areas. And when I come back from sabbatical next year, I'm going to start to train up a frog dog, so a specific dog that can sniff out Leiopelma frogs, and I'm going to be taking it to a lot of these really prime frog habitats that nobody's found any frogs in at the moment, and hopefully me and my frog dog will find a whole load of frogs that have been hiding out there from people. So the South Island is very good for rhiniformis and ewingi. And if anybody needs to interrupt and ask me questions as we go along, then please, I don't know, make a signal or just interrupt me or interrupt or get hold of Kerry or something, and I'll shut up for a couple of minutes and people can talk. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to wait till the very end, but this is a good time to ask a question. It sounds like the South Island used to be habitat for some of those endangered frogs. And what has the discussion been like about introducing frogs, native frogs, to the South Island?
Yeah, we found subfossil records on the South Island of native frogs. And subfossil records really mean ones that have not been fully fossilized. So around about 300 to 1,000 years old. So certainly within human invasion of the South Island, there were native frogs there when humans first arrived less than 1,000 years ago. And certainly we're starting to look at areas on the South Island in the light of climate change, because of course the North Island, even if we stopped everything now and climate change were to stop now, the effects of what we've done to the atmosphere would carry on, and it would make a lot of the areas up on the North Island unsuitable for frogs. So we are looking at specific places on the South Island as possible habitat for future frog translocations. And we've also even found a couple of places there that would be suitable for frogs from Australia. So those would be assisted colonizations, where we would be moving frogs out of their natural range to areas in New Zealand that would actually be suitable. And we've had discussion with the guys at Taronga Zoo about corroboree frogs, and that didn't actually go anywhere, but we've got just the perfect habitat for corroboree frogs. We don't have chytrids in those areas because there's no frogs in those areas. So there's a lots of potential for the South Island being like a Noah's Ark for a lot of frog species that couldn't live anywhere else.
Can you say a few more things about that? Because I don't usually hear about introducing frogs into their non-native habitats, especially some other countries' frogs. And, what are other potential impacts on, I guess, they wouldn't really be affecting the amphibian fauna if there is no amphibian fauna, but they certainly have impacts of who knows what happens. We know that weird things can happen when we bring in species. And maybe say something, the corroboree frog is, as I think, one of the most endangered of the Australian frogs. Can you say why that frog and what you think potential impacts would be?
Yeah, so with the corroboree frog, the main issue that's been with it is that it succumbs to the chytrid fungus. And in its habitat, there's another native Australian species of frog that is a reservoir host for the chytrid fungus. So you couldn't really ever get its habitat clean of the chytrid fungus, because you always got these other native frogs that are bringing it in and out. So you'd have to wipe out another native species to protect the corroboree frog. So the only thing that they're trying to do is to breed up the corroboree frogs so that they become more resistant to the chytrid fungus. But it is a really difficult problem. And we felt that in the short term, the medium to short term, maybe 20, 50 years, we could start to build up stocks of corroboree frogs in an area behind Kaikoura, which is very similar to Mount Kosciuszko, that it's got these peat bogs, it gets snow, and the ponds fill up with the snow water. We've had a look at what issues this could cause in the environment. Obviously, ones would be something like rhinovirus coming in, chytrid fungus coming in with the corroboree frogs. But as we don't have any native frogs on the South Island, we're not particularly worried about those sorts of things. We'd have to check to make sure that there was sufficient food, because the corroboree frogs like to eat things like ants and small invertebrates like that. We don't have, as far as we know, we don't have very many endangered species of invertebrates, so we couldn't see that there would be an ecological disaster by bringing in corroboree frogs. And New Zealand has a very good history of introduced animals, and a very good history of introduced animals causing complete mayhem when you introduce them. So we're very cognizant and very careful about what we introduce nowadays. And we've just introduced 11 species of dung beetles, and that went through a very rigorous procedure before we were allowed to release these into the wild. And they seem to be having a really good effect on all the dung that we're having to deal with on the South Island. So I feel we are very cautious about the way that we assess these things, and that it is quite a likely, it could be a good possibility of an assisted colonization effect. However, the big but is the politics behind all this. And the politics of the New Zealand government allowing in something for a conservation purpose from another country, and then the Australian government allowing us to take away some of their corroboree frogs to release in New Zealand, those hurdles are probably way too big to actually overcome. So I would think this is probably not going to happen, although biologically and from a conservation point of view, it would probably be a good idea. I think the powers that be would probably prevent it from happening.
Okay, thanks. And what about the native, what about the Hamiltoni and Pakeka going on to the South Island?
Yeah, those ones there, we've got to find suitable areas. And the big issue that we find whenever we move frogs around in New Zealand is that we have to, before we can move them from one area to another, we have to know why they're not in that area in the first place. So although we might go in and we eyeball it and we think, yes, the habitat looks really good. If I was a frog, I would like to live here. And that's how a lot of translocations have been done in the past. We are now going in with a very critical scientific eye, and we are analyzing the habitat. We're working out if the microclimate is exactly the same as the microclimate. The plants are the same. We've recently discovered that Archie's frogs really like to breed inside tree fern logs. So you can't really then expect a breeding population to go well in an area without tree ferns. So we're finding out a lot more information about how the amphibians use the environment. And if the frogs aren't there in a what's seemingly like a perfect environment, then we've got to work out why they're not there. Are they not there because of predators, because of a very dry, cold time in winter, or is it a disease issue? We have to work that out before we can actually then go ahead and conduct a translocation. And I'll tell you more about translocations later on in the talk, because that's our main sort of conservation tool that we're using in New Zealand.
Okay, thanks a lot for that, Phil.
Okay, I'll carry on. Okay, so just again, talk a little bit about our special native frogs in New Zealand. So they are evolutionarily ancient amphibians. And if you have a look at this lovely little graph here, the blue line at the top there is when humans started to become around. So the human species only been around for about 200,000 years. So you can see that frogs have been around for an awful lot longer than humans. Dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago. That's that red line there. But if we look way down here of when the Liopelmatidae diverged from the rest of the Anurans, this was around about 220 million years ago. And the Liopelmatidae had been evolving along their own separate pathway for probably 180 million years. So they're an incredibly ancient amphibian. They're the primitive ancestral group of all modern day amphibians. And a lot of the modern amphibians, like the Rhinoidea, have only really been around for a couple 100,000 years. So they are really, really an ancient group. And when we have a look at their biology, you'll see some very interesting and ancient peculiarities that they've kept through time. So I don't know, can everybody hear that squeak? You hear the squeak? No? Nobody can hear.
I don't think I heard about. Maybe you can make the squeak, Phil.
Well,
we got it.
Anybody hear the squeak? You hear the squeak there? Okay,
yeah.
That's good. I know I've just got to pull out my headphones in order to hear that. So that's the noise that these frogs make. So they were thought to be silent. And the main reason why they're thought to be silent is because they lack an external and middle ear structures. So if you look at the picture here, where you would normally see a frog's tympanic membrane, the eardrum on the side of the head, these frogs don't have anything like that at all. So they don't have the external structures. They don't have the middle ear structures as well, because the frog's hearing system consists of a tympanic membrane and then a bone that's called the columella, which then conducts the sound through the middle ear into the inner ear, and then you've got the nerve cells in the inner ear that pick up the sound. These frogs don't have the middle ear or the external ear, so they are unlikely to be able to hear airborne sound very well. A couple of other earless frogs throughout the animal kingdom have been found that they can actually detect airborne vibrations through bones in their forearms that then through bone conduction get transmitted to the inner ear, where where you have the amphibian in the basilar papilla so that they can actually hear. So it's possible that the lyre palmatids can hear some kind of airborne sound, but it would probably be in the low frequencies, and they wouldn't be able to hear that sort of squeak that you can hear them making. The other interesting thing is that we're not quite sure how they make that squeak, because they also don't have vocal cords. So they don't have vocal cords, they don't have ears, yet they can make this sort of yelp when they are very stressed. And I've hardly ever hear them yelp. Normally, the first time it was described was somebody was cutting a path through the bush, and they obviously hit one of these little frogs with a spade, and they heard the yelping, and they looked down and they saw that they'd nearly chopped the frog in half. So generally they don't make a noise, but I would imagine if they're attacked by a predator or somebody with a big spade, then they do tend to make this squeaking noise. When you dissect these frogs, which is quite difficult because they're an endangered species, but we were lucky enough to do some basic morphology on these frogs, and we had to kill 8 in order to dissect them and see what's inside. You see that they have these things called inscriptional ribs. And these inscriptional ribs, you can see pointing, they're like chevrons. So they're across like this on their belly, in the musculature of their belly. And they have 4 pairs of these inscriptional ribs. And these are cartilaginous ribs. They're the only frog that we know of that has these ribs. So it's a unique structure to the lyre palmatidae. So very, very strange. And we've thought often, why have they got these ribs? What's the relevance? And recently we did a study where we looked at their jumping behavior. So if you think about how frogs jump, this is a leopard frog, Rana pipiens or Lithobates pipiens. And you can see that's a very classic style. If I asked you how a frog jumps, then most of you would say it jumps just like this. And this is a special setup that we've got where we use a mirror at 45 degrees. You can see at the top of the screen, we've got this mirror at 45 degrees, got a high-speed camera at 750 frames per second, watching how this frog jumps. So if you watch the way they take off, they extend their back legs, they push that forward, they rotate their forelimbs around now, ready there, you can see, to take that pressure when they land, absorb the shock, and then they recycle the back legs very quickly to jump again. And this is classical modern high-lid jumping behavior. So most frogs, this is how they jump. They get ready, quite a large jump. You know, you're going about 6 or 7 body lengths, and then immediately it's prepared to jump again. So watch how the lyre palmatids jump. So this is a lyre palmatid jumping. Whee! You can see very, very different style of landing. Very similar the way they jump, but there's no attempt to absorb the shock with the forearms. The forearms actually go in more of a skydiving pose. They're behind them. They land on their belly. They don't recycle the legs ready to jump again until they've already landed. So you can see they take a while to sort of stagger and that they recycle the back legs. So we're feeling that this is probably why they have these inscriptional ribs, is to actually protect some of their internal organs when they're doing these belly flop landings. So this is a very primitive form of locomotion. These frogs, we'll see later on, sit around and they don't do very much. They rely on camouflage, and they probably only jump once, and they would sit still, blending in with the background so that the predator wouldn't be able to find them. So that's how they jump. What about how they, so with this slide here, you can see what we did. We spent over 130 hours watching these frogs in the wild to see actually how often they jump in the wild. And on the left-hand one here, we've got, this is a Scaphus montanus. This is lyre palma's closest relative that occurs in North America. Then we've got lyre palma hochstedteri, which is the semi-aquatic version. And then we've got our 2 terrestrial species, lyre palma parkeca and lyre palma archii. And you can see that when we look at jumping, jumping is orange. So these aquatic ones do a little bit of jumping, whereas our terrestrial species hardly ever jump naturally in the wild. So if you're just sitting watching these frogs, they would never jump naturally. They do a little bit of feeding, they do a little bit of moving their head, the black there, they move their head, and they rearrange their body, which is the blue. So our terrestrial species generally sit around and they don't do very much at all. A little bit of walking, a little bit of rearranging, a little bit of head moving. But what I want to bring your attention to is the scale on the y-axis here. You can see that this is mean proportion of time moved. And so if you look at Parkeka, this is 0.3. This is the mean proportion. So that means that 99.7% of the time we watch these frogs, they did absolutely nothing. So that's why I said in the blurb to advertise this, is that often these frogs are about as interesting as a small stone. You just sit and you watch these frogs and they sit and they do absolutely nothing. And while we were doing this experiment, you would hear people get all excited because they actually saw the frog move its head. So they watch it for several hours, and in those several hours, you might see it move its head once. So to see it walk is pretty exciting. So these frogs generally sit around and don't do anything at all. And it's something that as a New Zealander, when you work on these frogs, they're not like any other frogs. You don't have to rush up and sneak up on them and grab them. You can just literally go out, pick them up, look at them and put them down again, and they'll just stay there. So they hardly ever move. It's a great frog for an old man like me to work on. So what about swimming? And this is when we think about frogs swimming. This is the typical froggy stroke. You know, when you've got children, this is how your kids first learn to swim, is sort of by doing this. They might wave their arms around a little bit. And that's how most frogs swim. But the Leiopelma are the only frogs we know that actually swim using doggy style. So you see, this is actually an Escaphus. Escaphus do that as well. Sometimes it's classified as in the Leiopelmatidae family. They are very, very similar to Leiopelma, and they do this peculiar doggy style of swimming. So very, very quite strange behavior. And it's only these 6 species that we know of that actually swim in a sort of doggy paddle type style. So here's a little video of Leiopelma archii, and this just sort of shows you, this is the typical thing that they do. Well, that was quite an active one. It sort of almost tried to crawl away, but you can pick them up. You don't have to hold them tight like you would have to hold one of the big Australian frogs that would be jumping all over the place. These guys, you know, the only way I can get it to move around is to manipulate him a little bit so that he walks around. But otherwise, they're generally very happy to sit still. And I had one of my students develop a technique to take urine samples from these frogs, and she could just let the frog sit in her hand while she stuck a great big silicone tube in its cloaca and extract urine. She wouldn't have to restrain the frog at all. The frog would just sit there just like this, and you would poke a catheter up into its cloaca and it just sits still, and it's perfectly happy to do that. So you can see they really don't move around very much at all. So they've got quite an interesting breeding behavior. It's not unique to Leiopelma. A lot of frogs have terrestrial nests and look after their babies, so they have parental care. With Leiopelma, what we've been finding is that the males look after the eggs, and they normally like to be inside a tree fern at this stage. And one of my students is discovering that they use the same tree ferns year after year after year. So the tree fern dies and it's hollow inside, and then the frogs go inside here. They meet up with their partners, the males and females. We're not 100% sure of how they recognize each other, but they will meet up. They hang out in this tree fern for several months, and then a female must somehow tell the male she's about to lay some eggs, and he fertilizes them. They don't seem to have a traditional amplexus embrace like a lot of frogs. They seem to sort of squat near each other, and the male fertilizes the eggs, and then he sits over the eggs, and he's always got his body or his arms over the eggs, presumably putting on a lot of his skin secretions on the eggs to stop them from being infected with bacteria and fungi. They don't have very many eggs, normally around about 6 to 10 eggs at a time. They're very big eggs, full of yolk, and the male will guard them for several months. Once they eventually hatch out, and you can see this one at the bottom here, you've got a little embryo developing on this big yolk sac. Once they eventually hatch out, they undergo full metamorphosis within the egg, and they hatch out as a little froglet. So here's the little froglets, and then they climb onto dad's back, and dad hops around with these little froglets on his back for another couple of months until you end up with a little frog round about 11 millimeters, 10 millimeters long, and then they will hop away and lead a solitary life until it's their turn to breed. So that's the typical breeding of our terrestrial Leiopelma species. So remember, we've got 3 terrestrial species, and we've seen this in 1 species. The other 2 species, it's never been observed in the wild. We've seen it in the lab, and we can assume what we're seeing in the lab probably happens in the wild, but they've never been found breeding in the wild. So we've still got to find that. So this is Archie's frog. It's one of the terrestrial species, and it's quite interesting to see where it occurs in New Zealand. We have 2 mainstream populations, one in the Coromandel Peninsula up here. So Auckland's over here in this sort of area around here. And we've got another population down here near Tikuiti, which is in a forest called Whare Forest. So they're nationally critical. They are critically endangered according to the IUCN, and it's the world's #1 edge amphibian. So this is the area up here where there's very good gold mining around here. So we're always fighting with the government, trying to make sure that they don't open up these areas to gold mining prospecting. And that's going quite well at the moment. We had a big decline, and we think that it was probably due to the chytrid fungus. So back in 1994, this was the mainstay, the main population in the Coromandel, and we discovered a fairly new small population in Whare. And then by 2010, we'd had an 88% decline around the Coromandel Peninsula. It's quite hard now to find Archie's frogs here, but we have a really good population here. So I've got another couple of students and projects where we're looking at what's happening in Whare. Why are the frogs doing well in Whare, but they're not doing well in Coromandel? There's chytrid fungus in both populations, but the Whare population just seems to be able to exist with a very small amount of chytrids, whereas the chytrids seem to have really knocked the Coromandel population quite badly. So we're doing research on that at the moment. When we look at Hamilton's frog, so Hamilton's frog, Leiopelma hamiltoni, are nationally critical, but on the IUCN list, it's endangered. It occurs on an isolated island here, Stevens Island, in the Marlborough Sounds. And in the last 10 years or so, we've translocated from that population to another island there, Nuku Waiata, and I'll talk more about that a little bit later on. But you see these black triangles here, and these are bones or fossils of where the distribution of this Leiopelma hamiltoni used to be. So it used to be quite widely distributed on both islands, but now only restricted naturally to Stevens Island in the Marlborough Sounds. With the Maud Island frog, it's debatable whether this is a different species from the Stevens Island frog, and we'll probably be synonymizing these 2 species later on in this year. And they occur naturally on Maud Island, but we have moved them around. There's around about 40,000 of these frogs on Maud Island, so we sort of use this as our guinea pig to perfect the translocations to other places. And we've translocated them to quite a few places now, but I'll be talking about that in a minute. And then we have our Hochstetter's frog, which is our semi-aquatic one. This one has been observed breeding in the wild. And you can see that these are our commonest and most widely spread frogs. And they are distributed only around this upper part of the North Island. Although you can see with these triangles here, they used to occur on the South Island as well. So they're vulnerable at the moment, but we think that there's probably many more than just one species here. So when we look at the genetics of these guys, we can find that there's at least 5 good genetic groupings. And then these bright green dots over here are sort of abnormalities that they don't really fit in with any other genetic groups. Particularly this one here at Otawa, and the area where this frog occurs has just been made a sanctuary so we can protect the area, because this one seems to be morphologically and genetically very distinct from all other Hochstetter's frogs. So we're going to be doing some work on this later on in this year, but it's quite likely that we'll name this as a new species of Hochstetter's frog. Very similar to these guys, but actually quite distinct, and more distinct than there is between some of the Archie's frogs and the Hamilton's frogs. So Hochstetters actually lay their eggs in water underneath the stone, but are still the endotrophic tadpoles. So the tadpoles don't feed. They're like fish tadpoles. They have this massive yolk sac, and they undergo the complete metamorphosis without ever needing to eat anything because they've got enough yolk. It's a very funny tadpole. It's not like your normal tadpole. It's not pigmented. It doesn't really swim very well. It sometimes likes to crawl out onto the mud and flip around like that. So it's a very unusual sort of tadpole. So these frogs here are the Rhinoidea, and they occur, Rhinoidea rhiniformis. It's endangered in Australia, but it's actually doing really, really well in New Zealand. And I've got a guy from Melbourne University coming out later on in this year to do some research on these frogs in New Zealand. And it's a great place to work on them in New Zealand, because to work on them in Australia is quite difficult because they're an endangered species. You need lots of permits, you need lots of permission, you need to be able to try and find the frogs, whereas in New Zealand you can work on exactly the same species. They're not protected by any wildlife act or anything like that. The only thing you'd need would be animal ethics permission, and if you're doing non-invasive studies, then that's easy to get hold of. So I can play you the call. Hopefully it will work here, and you should be able to hear that. So many people say to me, oh, I've got New Zealand frogs in my garden. And I say, well, what noise do they make? And they say, oh, it's a croaking noise. And I think, well, then they're not New Zealand frogs, they're Australian frogs. And that's what we find, is many people in New Zealand think they have New Zealand frogs, whereas they've actually got the introduced Australian frogs. So can people hear me all right? Yeah, that's good. So I actually don't need to put my headphones on. So I'll take those off, and hopefully everyone can hear me. So they occur over the whole of New Zealand, and as I say, very common. Where I live down here, this is Dunedin, this is where I am at the moment, and this is Central Otago, and the guy in Central Otago uses their tadpoles as fertilizer. So he's got so many ponds and so many tadpoles that he can go through, and he collects all the tadpoles and uses them as fertilizer, which of course upsets a lot of Australians because they're an endangered species in Australia. Another species that we have of an introduced one is Rhinoidea aurea, and these are much more delicate than the rhiniformis. And if you draw a line across the top of the North Island at about 38 degrees, these frogs only occur north of that line. And there are areas where they do overlap with rhiniformis, and you end up with these hybrid frogs as well as they interbreed. So they occur around there, and they do occur in areas where we find our native frogs. And unfortunately, they have killed a couple of these green and golden bell frogs and found native frogs inside their stomach. So they do interfere a little bit with our native frogs, but often they don't overlap in their habitat types. So they don't often come across native frogs. And they make a nice noise as well. So you know, Australians would be used to this sort of noise. So one of the frogs that we get in Dunedin, this is the commonest frog we find in Dunedin, and it's these little brown tree frogs, Litoria ewingi, all around the city, around the gardens. And with some of the work we've been doing on these guys is that we discovered a couple of years ago that this is the only known southern hemisphere frog that can be frozen solid. So most frogs are either freeze tolerant or that they avoid being frozen during the winter months, whereas this frog can actually be frozen solid in a block of ice, and then you can thaw it out and it's perfectly fine. And I've had a couple of master's students do their research on this, and they find that they upload glycerol as they're getting cold, so it acts like an antifreeze, and they don't get a lot of cellular damage when they thaw out after being frozen solid. So these were introduced originally from Tasmania, where I'm sure they had evolved their freezing tolerance. So what are the main threats to New Zealand frogs? And the biggest threat, like to many of our wildlife here in New Zealand, are introduced mammalian predators. We have a huge suite of introduced predators in New Zealand, from stoats and weasels and ferrets and possums and hedgehogs and cats, and the list goes on. And most of these like to eat frogs. So it's a huge problem that we have with these mammalian predators. And often you'll find that the reason why we've got frogs left on these offshore islands is that they are islands where the predators hadn't managed to get to yet. So as long as we keep those islands predator-free, then the frogs are relatively safe there. Another thing that happened with a couple of waves of human colonization in New Zealand. First, we had Maori people that burnt a lot of the forest, and then the Europeans came, who were much worse and burnt even more of the forest. So a lot of our forest was destroyed, and the frog populations became very fragmented. So we are desperately trying to hold on to as much natural bush as we can at the moment. With the introduced and emerging diseases, we're always very wary of border control about what diseases could get into the country. We know we've got a chytrid strain that looks like it came from Australia originally. We haven't had any cases of rhinovirus yet in New Zealand, so we are always worried about the effects of these on our frogs. We've done some experiments in the lab where we've infected all the Leiopelma species with chytrid fungus, and we've actually found that they are all naturally resistant to the strains that we have in New Zealand. So we mustn't become complacent and think, oh, that doesn't matter now, we can let chytrid into the country, because if we get the hypervirulent pandemic strain into the country, then that could very well wipe out all our native frogs. So we're still being very vigilant at the borders about allowing introduced amphibians and therefore introduced diseases into the country. Climate change is a big issue for us in New Zealand because most of these frogs like to live above 400 meters above sea level into the cool forests and the cloud forests. So they are very much going to be affected by climate change. So that's why we're saying we are looking at safe havens that will be safe places in 50 years' time, given the current climate change scenarios. And then as one of the questions that Kerry sent to me, is that we do have an issue that we're trying to increase the public awareness about these frogs, because of course in New Zealand, everyone cares about animals like kiwi, kakapo, the big flightless birds, the animals like tuatara, they're charismatic. People care about those, but it's very difficult for them to care about frogs, because frogs are just these funny little brown creatures that most people will never see. They are terrible in a display at the zoo. Auckland Zoo has them on display, but so many people just walk past and you can't see any frogs in the actual display. So they are very bad display animals, and it's very difficult getting people excited about animals and caring about animals that they can never actually see for themselves. So our main areas that we deal with frog conservation are predator control, habitat protection, and we do a lot of conservation translocations. We've written a native frog recovery plan, and this has everything, and I can send anyone a PDF of this if they want. This tells you what we need to do in order to secure and recover all Leiopelma populations by 2050. So it's a really good roadmap on how we're going to be protecting the frogs in New Zealand. So predator control, for many of you, you'll know that we use something called 1080, which is a very nasty mammal-specific toxin, and it occurs naturally in plants in Australia, and it's been used in Australia quite a lot as well, because a lot of the mammals in Australia are actually resistant to it, because it occurs naturally in plants there. And it's been very effective at killing things like rats and mice and stoats and those sorts of animals. So a lot of the predators we can control with ground baiting with poisons like 1080. There has been a lot of controversy in New Zealand about using 1080 because it does kill a certain amount of birds. But the studies that we've been doing at this university is that if you do nothing, using 1080 is the lesser of two evils. Is that it has a bad side to it, but it's better than doing nothing at all. Particularly in years like last year, where we had a very good season for the beech trees. So you end up with the beech trees making a huge amount of beech seeds, which then causes a boom in the population of mice, which then causes a boom in the population of rats, which then causes a boom in the population of stoats and ferrets, and so on. And all of a sudden, the rats, the stoats, and the ferrets have nothing to eat because they've eaten everything, and they turn to native animals like ground nesting birds and frogs and lizards and things like that. So by knocking these mammals on the head with those poisons, it's better than doing nothing at all, particularly in these beech seed years. So predator control is a big part of New Zealand frog conservation. Another thing we do is protect habitat. So not only protecting habitat by making sure that it falls under protected areas, we have something called Schedule 4. Schedule 4 is land that is of high conservation value in New Zealand and therefore should never be touched. And that's what Save the Frogs became involved with a number of years ago, when the New Zealand government was going to take some land off Schedule 4 and open it up to mining. And a lot of us all got together, and it was probably a smokescreen that the government actually wanted to grab some land on the South Island, which doesn't have frogs, so we weren't too concerned about that. But they eventually decided to leave it on Schedule 4. So a lot of that land is still protected. So that's in protected areas. But even within these protected areas, we have things like this. This is a herbivore-proof fence. So this fence really protects the area inside where there are frogs to the area outside where things like goats and deer and pigs have been coming out and eating the undergrowth. So you find that the frogs are pretty safe inside, whereas outside they're not so safe because the habitat is being destroyed by larger herbivorous introduced mammals. And then conservation locations, and we've done a number of conservation locations. And one of our hotspots for conservation locations, translocations, is the Marlborough Sounds. So this is this area here between the North and the South Island. There are lots of islands there, and it's fairly easy to make these islands predator-free. They've got to be a certain distance from the mainland so that you can't get the mammals re-invading. So this little white island right up the very top there, that's Stevens Island, where we have some of the frogs that we moved to Nuka Waiata Island, which is there. We have our Maud Island frogs that I'll tell you about a little bit more in a minute. And then over here next to Long Island and Motuara Island are areas that we've been moving frogs around in the Sounds. The problem that we have is that we are always competing with other conservation groups. So particularly with Motuara Island, this was an island sought after by the Kiwi people because the Kiwi conservationists felt that this island was a great place to have kiwi, and unfortunately kiwi eat frogs. So we are always fighting with the people there that, you know, who's going to be allowed to put their animals there, because we can't have kiwi and frogs because the kiwis eat the frogs. So it's always this sort of bone of contention that we have with these guys. So these are the conservation translocations. These first two in blue were intra-island, so within the island, and these were our early translocations that we did. And all the ones in black there are conservation translocations that we did from one island to another island in the Marlborough Sounds. And then this sort of dark red one here is one that we did to the mainland to a sanctuary. The red one at the bottom here is one that we did in 2006 as an emergency translocation when we discovered chytrid fungus in the Farrier Reno population. We moved them about 100 kilometers away, and we've just done a reinforcement to that population in 2016. So I'm happy to chat to you more about that one. But just to give you some idea about what translocations we've done, this is Maud Island that you remember I showed you a couple of slides ago. And this was the first translocation that was conducted by Ben Bell, who is a sort of the father of frogs in New Zealand. He's done some of the original conservation work, and he just got 100 frogs from the main habitat here on Maud Island, and he moved them to an area called Boat Bay, about 1 kilometre away. And Ben has got some of the longest running frog monitoring data in the world. He's been going back to this area for over 40 years, and some of the frogs that he marked 40 years ago are still there today. So they are over 40 years old. He marked them as an adult, so they would have been at least 5 or 6 years when he marked them, and he's now catching these frogs 43 years later. So it's amazing that these frogs are old. Some of the ones I've had in the lab, I've had for 17 years in the lab, and when my students work on them, I need to make sure that they realize that these frogs are probably older than the students who are working on them. So they're very, very long-lived. And so he put 100 frogs there, and then he went back and he monitored them. So he did this in 1984, 85, and then by 2008, he'd had 73 new frogs there, and it really was doing really well. And it seemed to be that they were doing better in Boat Bay than they had in this remnant area. So it's almost like competitive release, better food, better space, and the frogs actually were doing really, really well there. Another one we did that I find quite interesting is this one on Stevens Island. And you can see Stevens Island here. It's a remote island in the Cook Strait, very difficult to get to, very difficult to land on. You've got to jump from the boat onto the cliffs, and the guy driving the boat has got to time it with the swell. So that as the boat rises in the swell, you've got to jump off the front of the boat. Very difficult to get to, very difficult for mammals to get to, very isolated. But there is this remnant population of frogs in this tiny little area up on the top here where the red arrow is. There's a little saddle there. And it was an area with a small number of frogs that we called the frog bank. And in this area, when we first went to count these frogs, there were 300 frogs. That was the estimated population size, only 300 frogs. So what we thought we would do is that we would make another area about 70 meters away called the frog pit, and we translocated 12 of those frogs and we put them in the frog pit. But what happened is that over the next couple of years, a couple of them managed to go back the 70 meters to the frog bank. And so it's a tiny little frog that spends 99.7% of its life sitting still doing nothing. And it actually managed to cover 70 meters over that time. And the biggest problem are these guys. On Stevens Island, we've got tuatara. We've got 50,000 tuatara. So it's a tuatara haven. They're a nuisance when you go to Stevens Island. They're under your feet. You've got to kick them out the way. And the worst thing is they eat the frogs. So what we had to do, and we did this in 2004, is that we took the fence out of the frog bank and we put another big tuatara fence linking the frog pit to the frog bank. And very slowly we've been watching the frogs sort of leaving the frog bank and expanding into this area in between the frog pit and the frog bank where they are safe from the tuatara. And every time we go and monitor the frogs, we find the odd tuatara that's managed to get in or under the fence, and then we pick it up and we put it in our backpack. We take it down to the lighthouse and we spin it round about 20 times, and then we let it go there, and hopefully it doesn't get its own way back to the frog bank. So these are just other ones that I just wanted to show you quickly. So there's Maud Island to Motuara Island. We've done that twice now. We've put over 600 frogs on Motuara, and they do seem to be doing quite well, but we do have a fence around them to protect them from the kiwi. And this is the Stevens Island one. So this was always a very nervous time for me because we did a population model where we worked out how many frogs can we take from a population of 300 and put onto Nuka Waiata and not kill the original population and give the best chances of survival of a translocated population. And the model that we ran 10,000 times recommended that we did this with 70 frogs. And we did this in 2006. And we've been monitoring that one for the last 11 years. And now the population on Nuka Waiata is doing very well. And good news, the population on Stevens Island is also doing very well. So taking 70 frogs from the population of 300 hasn't caused any decline in the numbers there, and it's been big enough here to actually have a very good population on Nuka Waiata. So we're becoming experts in frog translocations. And one of the things that we do before we translocate frogs to an area, we put in a boardwalk. So this is a boardwalk. It's just an elevated walk so that researchers or people going in to monitor the frog populations don't walk on the substrate. So this is a rocky area. There'll probably be frogs under the rocks. So you don't want to be walking on there where you could risk crushing the frog. So what you tend to do is that you build this boardwalk before you put any frogs there. So you're drilling holes in the ground and you're putting in supports. And then once the frogs have been released there, you can walk this fixed pattern through the vegetation without any risk of standing on a frog or causing the rocks to move and crush a frog. When we release the frogs, this is on Nuka Waiata, and you can see that we position the frogs in a certain area here where they're in the same social format as when we collected them from Stevens Island. So this frog here on Stevens Island would have had those two frogs as its nearest neighbors, roughly 50 centimeters away, and we made sure that he stayed with his neighbors on the new island. So trying to do those sorts of things for conservation. When we've gone to the mainland sanctuaries, what we've done is that we've put them in these pens. These are moored islands in Karori Sanctuary. This is Ben Bell here, who's recently retired now, leaving me as the only academic working on frogs in New Zealand. But Ben and I still do a lot of work together. And since his retirement, he's had more time to spend doing work on frogs. So these are the frogs that he's been working on in Zealandia, which is an eco-sanctuary. He's slowly releasing these into the eco-sanctuary here. So that's another good success story. What about captive breeding? And Auckland Zoo have been pretty successful in breeding Archie's frogs at the moment. They've got these little guys from Auckland Zoo are now coming up to the stage where they could be breeding themselves. So they're nearly up to the stage of getting F2, although they have very low numbers. Hamilton Zoo have been trying to breed Hochstetter's frogs, and they've got lots of egg clutches being laid at the moment, and these develop through to the tadpole stage and then they die. So we haven't quite worked out what's going wrong. Just before the talk today, I had an email from Arana Park, who it's in Christchurch, who, although they've had some major setbacks with snow and earthquakes and fire, everything you can possibly think about, they've had this in the pipeline for about 7 years, and they have just finished this facility now. So I'll be flying up next week to advise them on some of the last final arrangements, and they'll hopefully be getting some moored island frogs within the next month. So they'll be trying to breed moored island frogs in captivity. So that's sort of ending up my talk really now, just talking a little bit about, I know that somebody asked, how do we get people excited about frogs, even though most people would never see them? And that's where I've been enlisting the help of people like Jane Goodall. She's been to see me a couple of times here. She likes frogs a lot. So every time she's here, I can get photographs with her and get her talking about the native frogs in New Zealand. This is Lucy Lawless, Xena, Princess Warrior, been in, film actress. And this is Archie's frog. This is our emblem. This is an Archie's frog toy, and she's been taking this around and introducing Archie's frog to lots of celebrities in Hollywood and places like that, and getting the frog message out there. When Prince Charles and Camilla came to visit last year, I managed to get 30 seconds with the prince, which ended up being about 10 minutes, but at least I managed to get the native frogs out there. And of course, there's lots of media coverage of why was the prince looking at frogs in New Zealand and those sorts of things. And this is our Minister of Conservation. So she's our current Minister of Conservation here. And this is actually taken in Zealandia. So we managed to get her interested in frogs. You know, it's important that the Conservation Minister is not all focused on kiwi and kakapo and the charismatic animals like that, that she also realizes that it's important to be involved with amphibians as well. And then lastly, some of you might have seen these shirts. In fact, there's Kevin there. So I've got a picture of Kevin with one of those shirts, so that's pretty good. But I got lots of people to wear these shirts, and while a lot of people say, but this isn't true, and generally it's not true. I mean, the survival of the earth doesn't depend on frogs, but a lot of us like to think it does. But the most important thing about this slogan is that it makes people stop and talk to you. So it was designed by a human resources company that support New Zealand frog conservation. And it's just an amazing shirt to wear because people always stop you and ask, what do you mean? Why do we need frogs? What's important about frogs? And it opens up the dialogue immediately, and you can tell them how important frogs in the ecosystem. So that's it for me. Sorry I went on for so long. You know, I'm happy. I've only got to eat my lunch, but I'm happy to answer any questions or have a chat about anything people want to chat about. I'll stop sharing my screen now, maybe.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Phil Bishop, expert on New Zealand frogs. Thanks for going into so much detail about the frogs themselves and all of your efforts, and fantastic job getting all those celebrities and politicians involved in the frogs. Let's see, I have a couple of questions for you. Why is the Ascaphus frog related to Leopelma, or how did that come to be that they're so geographically separated?
It's a good question, and it's been something that we've thought about quite often. And it's, you know, if you think about when Pangaea split from Gondwana, and that's the only, because they're ancient frogs, at the time of the split where the Gondwana land started to move away, then the Ascaphus were on Pangaea and the Leopelma were on Gondwana, and it's that old, their divergence. So, you know, 200 million years ago, that's when those frogs went their own ways. And for some reason, I don't know why, but in North America, those frogs have managed to hang on, and in New Zealand, they've managed to hang on. And those would have been the frogs that would have been on both of those large continents when they first split.
Okay, thank you. If you can, do stop sharing your screen. If
yeah, how do I do that, Kerry? What do I press?
There's probably a button at the very bottom. It says share screen. It may have a green arrow. Or
you see, I don't have any buttons at the bottom now. How do I get the buttons back?
I'm not too sure. It's not a big deal though. At least we have pictures of your cool shirt. If
Maybe
anyone out there,
just drag your mouse down to the bottom of your screen. It might pop up.
Oh, right. So I've got Zoom. I see it now. No. I could get rid of that.
It's not a big deal. Don't worry about it. Yeah, just leave that. That's a nice looking frog. So we can talk with that frog here. Yeah, so you brought up the fact that it's hard to get people interested in the frog. One of the questions that we got from when people were registering for this event was, is there anything the average person can do, being that they're so geographically far away from the frogs? Even the frogs on the mainland are difficult to find, and they, you know, I hiked up to Faria Reno, and I recall that being a good long hike. People aren't going to randomly end up there. Is there anything the average person can do besides possibly contacting politicians and lobbying and campaigning for protection of land?
Yeah, I get asked this question a lot, and it is really difficult. And I often just flippantly say, "Oh, just give me all your money." But you know, it's bigger than that, and it's living in a very sustainable way. So it's looking after the environment and thinking about what goes down the drains and what you're spraying on your garden, you know, and all those sorts of things, and doing your bit for climate change. I mean, climate change is going to be one of our biggest threats to our amphibians, and I did have it in the native frog recovery plan, and the government made me take it out because it was basically just in the too hard basket. They didn't know how to deal with that. So it was just really difficult, you know, those sorts of things. So it is very difficult to get people involved. So it really is lobbying people, getting people to talk about frogs, and you know, it'll be yeah, it's really difficult.
With regards to climate change, because that's it's in the news all the time. There's still always people denying it, and there's they always come back to, oh, there's controversy. What do you see as the if there are any current impacts of climate change that you've already detected affecting frogs in New Zealand, and when you're talking about future problems associated with climate change, what is the time frame on that, and what do you see happening?
Yeah, I must admit it's not my greatest area of expertise, but we've had a couple of people that have done sort of climate change modelling for New Zealand and been looking at how, and in actual fact, there's some areas on the North Island that will become more suitable for frogs. So as long as there's forest there, it'll become more suitable for the frogs under the next scenario of climate change. But the problem is the frogs won't be able to get there. So we're going to have more options for translocation. And because the frogs don't move very much themselves and they're reluctant to move from one area to another, then we're going to have to be looking at more places to move them. Certainly, I would imagine that the cloud base is going to rise. So the frogs are not going to be very good at going uphill. And certainly when we translocate them, they do seem to move in a downhill fashion. So, we're just going to have to be very cognizant of how the climate is changing and then try and mitigate that with trying to move them.
Okay, thanks. Any of you listeners out there, thank you so much for still being here. And it sounds like Linda Jane may have something to say. But yeah, if any of you have something to say, then let's definitely get your questions coming in. You're also welcome to send in by chat if you don't want to speak. But Linda Jane, if you're there.
Yeah, I have a question around translocations and have public awareness. Is there any thoughts or ideas around translocating to places where the public might have an opportunity to see some of these frogs, so that might gain, I don't know if that'd be possible. I think you answered some of that by saying that Kiwi and Tuatara both eat frog. It probably rules out quite a few of the islands that have public access. But I don't know if there's such a thing, exclusion fences or things that might allow coexistence of those species.
Certainly, yeah. In places like Zealandia in Wellington, they do frog tours. So you can actually go into Zealandia at night and they do a nocturnal tour. And there's another one up on the North Island that we're going to be working with soon, who are trying to get Archie's frog and have an exhibit there where you can go. At the moment, you can go there, you can see kiwi at night, sort of walking around in an enclosure. So there are ideas of letting people go out and do that. But you almost have to be trained that they're not easy things to see at night because they are so well camouflaged. And I've set up a display down here in Dunedin, and I set up an area in a lecture theatre that looked like Maud Island. And then I had a glass cage which had leaf litter in, and I had 5 frogs in there. And it was all dimly lit and it was dark. And I gave people a red torch. And a lot of people would come out and they say, I couldn't see any frogs. And it's in a small glass cage and only on leaf litter. And the frogs are sitting on top of the leaf litter and they still couldn't see it. So you've almost got to have that search image so that you can know what you're looking for. But, I think it would be a very good idea if we could give people some kind of frog experience in a place like Orokonui or Zealandia, where they're actually seeing frogs that are in the wild. And if they went with a guide who actually had a laser, because lasers are really good at pointing things out to people, and just show them some frogs that are in the wild. But certainly going to places like Maud Island, then there are groups that do go to Maud Island. And that is I think it's called a scientific reserve, and DOC do take school groups in particular to Maud Island because that's where Sirocco or Kakapo does his off season there, so they can go and see Sirocco, they can go and see giant weta and lots of really cool things, and they also get to see the frogs as well. So there are a couple of places like that.
Well, thank you.
Oh, I've done it. I've managed to stop sharing.
I did that for you, Phil. I figured out how to do it.
I did it at the same time. That was good.
Yeah.
I found it said stop share up the top there.
Okay, good. Yeah, so it's good to have everybody here. Lisa, do you have a question? Was that okay? Great.
Yeah.
I think you should be able to unmute yourself. It sounds like you're here.
Yeah.
Hi, Save the Frogs volunteer. Lisa.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Right.
So I know that the cane toad in Australia is a very large problem. I'm assuming you don't have them in New Zealand because you didn't mention them. And are you worried about them coming to New Zealand?
Good question. We used to have cane toads here. So probably, 20 years ago, we had cane toads, and they were used at all the universities for dissections, and people had them. And I was really excited, and I thought, great, we've got cane toads, because I'm one of those weirdos that I really love cane toads. I think
So do I.
And so I was very excited by that. And then we had a government agency called IRMA, and they sent out a proposal to ban cane toads and thought that it would be really bad idea to keep them in New Zealand. And I actually put in a submission saying there's no need to ban them. We can just have them on the South Island, because the thermal minimum temperature for cane toads is 11 degrees. And there's nowhere on the South Island that doesn't get to 11 degrees in winter. So they wouldn't be able to exist on the South Island. And they, in their due diligence, they just said, no thanks, we're just going to ban them. So the ban from New Zealand, they were all killed probably 18 years ago. And that's, our border control are particularly good at checking people's shoes to make sure they haven't got a little toad in their shoes and things like that. We get every now and then, we get people trying to bring amphibians in illegally. Some of them get through and they end up in the wild, and then the government spends millions of dollars in eradicating those amphibians. So generally, we've had pobblebonk frogs here quite recently, that somebody brought in illegally and claimed that they found them in a stream somewhere, but it was somebody had released them there and then reported them. So they spent over $1 million getting rid of the pobblebonks. And yeah, it's quite an issue. But yeah, no cane toads, unfortunately. Otherwise, I would have them in my office.
And yeah, thank you all for being here. Thank you so much, Dr. Phil Bishop, for telling us all about these frogs. Any final questions from anyone?
I had one more. I came in late. And so did you mention to most or all of the frogs, the native New Zealand frogs, aren't able to vocalize?
That's right, yeah. Okay. So none of our frogs, they don't have vocal cords, they don't have any ears, so they don't make any sounds at all. And, when you talk to a lot of New Zealanders, they'll disagree with you because they've got a frog in their garden that croaks a lot and it's got to be a New Zealand native.
And it's an Australian, okay.
Australian, yeah.
That's fascinating. Okay.
Yeah, it's weird. Yeah, how they communicate, we still don't know, but we suspect it's something to do with chemical communication using scents and smells and things like that.
Okay. Thank you. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Hey, Phil, I was surprised to hear that you're the only New Zealand academic dedicated to frogs. What do you think of the future of, frog conservation and frog research in New Zealand?
Yeah, it's pretty sad because you probably noticed that I'm not particularly young. So, in 5 years' time, when I'll be looking at retirement, then, if we don't have any young people coming up, I'm hoping that some of my students will want to carry on. But, of course, getting an academic position nowadays is really difficult. I'm very pleased I'm not out there trying to get a job at the moment. And it's, they take the best person who's published in Science and Nature and things like that. And not a lot of frog conservationists publish in Science and Nature. So it's going to be difficult in the future, particularly with the New Zealand government that is not very frog focused. They're not very invertebrate focused either. They're focused on tuatara and birds, and that's their main focus. And if it's not a tuatara or a bird, then they're second-class citizens as far as conservation is concerned. So they need people at the universities to sort of keep them honest and keep it on their radar.
All right, well, we're going to be doing our best to get the word out about New Zealand frogs. I'm going to theoretically get a recording of this up to YouTube and on our site, and you can share it, send it to all those Department of Conservation biologists, and get a lot more people thinking about New Zealand frogs. And also, yeah, you mentioned a recovery plan. So if you send me the link to that, I can put that on the same page where I embed the video for this. And is there any particular website that you think people listening should go to learn more about you or your research or frogs?
Yeah, I mean, it needs updating because it's still the old style of website, but it's nzfrogs.org. If they go there, you know, that's got all the information about what's going on in New Zealand, New Zealand frog researchers of the past and of the present. So yeah, that's quite a good one.
Okay, nzfrogs.org, or for the Americans out there, nzfrogs.org.
Right.
And all right, thank you everyone. This was the inaugural Save the Frogs Australia New Zealand online video conference. You can register for these conferences at savethefrogs.com/au-nz. savethefrogs.com/au-nz. And thank you all for helping to save the frogs. Thank you, Dr. Phil Bishop.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Cheers.